Has the BBC knowingly put a target on a Palestinian child's back? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with the filmmaker, journalist, and author, Richard Sanders. Richard Sanders, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thank you for having me on.
The BBC documentary Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone, has been described as a scandal. And the first question I'd like to ask you is, in your view, was the scandal the fact that the BBC aired this documentary in the first place, or that it removed it from circulation, or perhaps a bit of both? And could you start by recounting the facts of the case for the
Well,
uninitiated?
yes, but the scandal is very much that it removed it. Now, what this was an hour-long documentary called Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone, where they had, the interesting idea of telling the story of the Gaza war through the eyes of children. One child in particular was used to narrate the film. Now, it stood out from virtually everything the BBC has done. The BBC has really struggled with the Gaza story. If you talk to people from the BBC, I'm sure they think they're managing to get a balance between the two sides. I think to me, it certainly seems as if they allow themselves to be disgracefully bullied by the Israel lobby. And also, I'd make the point that I'm not quite sure what balance between genocide, the victims of genocide, apartheid, the victims of apartheid, ethnic cleansing, the victims of ethnic cleansing these aren't issues, they're crimes. And I think my first point that I would make about the film, it was a very good film. It was a good film. I have one or two issues, but it was a good film. It humanized Palestinians without caveats in a way that nothing else that the BBC has done this year has succeeded in doing. I have a very strong objection to the fact that in Britain it is taken for granted, and I think North America is the same, that it is the Palestinians who must forever be placed under the microscope, who must be scrutinized, whose right to even speak must be questioned. And similar scrutiny is not applied to their tormentors, to the perpetrators of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid. I'm not telling you anything you don't know here, but there is this basic framing of the debate in the West, which I find fundamentally racist. I don't see why the victims of genocide are always having to justify themselves, and the perpetrators of genocide are getting a free ride. It's Hamas is an integral part of Palestinian life. Whenever one thinks of them, they clearly are an integral part of Palestinian life. They were the government in the Gaza Strip. And so if you're going to really say that no one who has any connection with Hamas can't be platformed, then you're effectively silencing the Palestinian people. Sorry if I hadn't made it clear. The issue here was that the kid they used as a narrator,
Abdullah al-Yazuri.
that's right, his father turns out to be a deputy agricultural minister in the Hamas government. That was the issue.
And sorry, just to be clear, Abdullah himself is all of 13 years old, so there were absolutely no accusations that he was somehow commander of the Qassam Brigade's artillery corps or anything. It was simply that he was the son of a government official.
That's right. And if you watch the program, no one's really querying the content of the film. No one's pointing to anything they say is inaccurate. And if you watch it, it's clear it's not presenting a Hamas point of view. I mean, if the Hamas had somehow slipped in a Hamas script via this kid, then obviously that would be a rather separate issue. But I mean, in fact, one of the rather clumsy and awkward things about the film is in the first 5 minutes, two characters firmly condemn Hamas. And say how much they loathe Hamas. Now, I'm sure there are people in the Gaza Strip who do feel like that. It felt rather clumsy to shoehorn that into the first 5 minutes, but it certainly, makes
Getting the alibi out front.
Yes, exactly. That's what they were doing, I guess. I mean, it felt rather painful to me, but it certainly makes absurd any idea that this was a Hamas film. Now, having said all that, journalistically, there is a question of transparency. And had I made this film, I'd have had a script line or something in there. It was certainly a hostage to fortune not to identify the child, and it provided an open goal for those who wanted to attack the program, and they took it. And as ever, the BBC caved absolutely shamelessly to these people. And in a way, I mean, I think what is worst about this is in their franticness to appease the attacks upon them. It clearly didn't occur to anyone at the BBC to think, well, hold on, what sort of danger if are we putting this kid, but also the crew on the ground in, if we're
That
sort of
that was going to be my next question, but if I could just finish on this issue. Um, if I understand correctly, you're basically saying that the documentary makers, which is an independent company named Hoyo Films rather than the BBC, that they should have, in the credits or whatever, um, uh, made a point of informing their viewers that this child, Abdullah al-Yazuri, is the father of a government official. Would that be standard practice? Would that be something that you would have done if
Yes,
you?
I would have done it. It is clearly a hostage to fortune. Not,
Mm,
I'd probably have said it in the voiceover. In fact, in the kid's own voiceover, I'd have said
yeah.
it.
Mm.
I mean, it's so obviously a stick. Yes. I mean, I think for the sake of transparency, I think that would have been normal, and I think it was a slip up on their part not to do that.
And given that they didn't do it, you nevertheless continue to maintain that the real scandal here is that the BBC fully withdrew this documentary from circulation, and it did so because, in your view, they were capitulating, appeasing a very strongly bullying Israel lobby.
That's correct.
Mm,
And it's all part of an attempt, a very successful attempt to chill the atmosphere, to have a chilling effect. And we've seen that subsequently. I was at the Royal Television Society Awards last Wednesday, and my film Gaza was up for an award, didn't win. It was beaten by another very, very good Al Jazeera film. But we were all waiting. The penultimate award of the night was meant to be a special recognition award for Gazan journalists in general, and never happened. And it subsequently, it turns out, they'd withdrawn it, and they sent an email to the various juries where they made it clear that it was because of this BBC furore, and they didn't want to add fuel to the fire. Now, just today, the Board of Deputies of British Jews has put out a statement saying they've been in touch with the RTS also about another nomination, which was for a colleague of mine, Hind Cowdery, as for one of the journalists of the year. She didn't win either. Clearly, the Board of Deputies objected to the fact that she was even nominated.
mm,
According to the Board of Deputies, the RTS has committed to looking into its nomination procedures. So these things always spill on. It's about establishing an atmosphere of intimidation where people are frightened to report accurately what is happening in
And
Palestine.
and it seems to be quite successful, but I'd now like to speak about something which is arguably even more dangerous than intimidation and the resulting appeasement, and that is a welfare of a child. Because the key issue, as we've been discussing, that was raised by the documentary's detractors concerns the family connections of its child narrator, the 13-year-old boy, Abdullah al-Yazuri. What do we know about these connections, and how are they relevant, if at all, towards decisions made about the documentary? Do you have anything to add to what we've already discussed regarding him in this
Well,
respect?
his father was the Deputy Agriculture Minister, a man who was educated in Britain, had lived a long time outside, clearly not part of the military side of Hamas. I mean, he's been described by various people as a technocrat.
Mhm.
I would imagine to have that job, he'd have to be a member
Mhm.
of Hamas. But what you have to
Or at least approved by them.
or certainly approved by them.
Mhm.
Yes, I mean the government is a Hamas
Mhm.
government, so that's the accusation here. But I think, um, yes, I mean, I think that, that's the core accusation, and I think that did need to be made clear. Now, the key point here is, as we know, Israel is accused of genocide in the Gaza Strip. More than 200 journalists have been killed in the Gaza Strip. These include 5 of my colleagues at Al Jazeera. Also, a number of family members of my colleagues have been killed at Al Jazeera. If you look at the circumstances in which the 5 colleagues of mine were killed, they're hunted down. It's not collateral. They're hunted down. Journalists face the terrible situation in Gaza, where not only do their press vests not protect them, they make them a target, and therefore they feel a responsibility for everyone around them. Now, in those circumstances, for the BBC to have gone along with a narrative which portrays the local film crew as effectively complicit with Hamas is appalling and disgraceful. And it clearly just didn't occur to anyone at the BBC to see it from that point of view. And also the child, yes, I mean, the child is 13. The BBC has duty of care to.
I was going to ask about that because I think the BBC has clear guidelines
Yes.
about a duty of care towards children, but in this particular instance, it seems like if anything, they put a target on his back.
That's right. I mean, one would hope the Israelis won't murder a 13-year-old child, although they've murdered many other children. But yes, of course they have a duty of care to children. And as I say, you sense a sort of panic the minute the lobby comes for them. The BBC just panics, and it clearly just didn't occur to them to think of the safety of the local Palestinians. I mean, you have a profound sense that in the hierarchy of the BBC, there is just a fundamentally different value attached to the lives of Israelis and of Palestinians.
You're an experienced documentary maker yourself. How does this particular case measure against others you're familiar with, including perhaps in your own work?
Well, so
Yes, please go
I've
ahead.
worked for British, as I say, I've made over 50 films for British terrestrial TV. In recent years, I have worked more for Al Jazeera's investigative unit, which I have to say, on this subject, certainly on the issue of Palestine and the Middle East, there's an absolute liberation. And it really puts, Al Jazeera is owned by, a Gulf dynasty, and people often throw that accusation at it. And that's certainly true. You can't get away from that. It's owned by the government of a country which internally does not have freedom of the press. And that rather begs the question how on earth it is that a Qatari-owned media company can do journalism which is so much better than the BBC on this topic. Now, so the first film I made for Al Jazeera was we presented an alternative perspective on this scandal, this crisis over anti-Semitism that had torn the
UK.
That torn the British Labour Party apart during the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. Now, Jeremy Corbyn was a very, very unusual leader of the Labour Party in that he was a socialist. I mean, he really was a socialist, which obviously alarmed a lot of people. The stick of anti-Semitism was really used to beat him mercilessly for years on end, and played a crucial part in destroying him. And we talked to the many Jews in the Labour Party, Jewish people who supported Corbyn and don't support Israel, because that's for the most part what it was about overall. And in particular, the BBC's flagship news and current affairs program, Panorama, had done this program in 2019, which was really the sort of final nail in the coffin for.
It was a hit job.
It was a hit job. I mean, there's a hit. That takes you into the sort of perilous terrain of motivation, which we'll steer clear of. Why the BBC felt obliged to broadcast this film is you'd have to ask them. But we flagged up a series of really profound and basic journalistic flaws in it. I mean, 2 of the most explosive stories were simply untrue. They just weren't true at all. And also, it is relevant to this one on the issue of transparency. One of the things that film did within the Labour Party, there were 2 organisations: the Jewish Labour Movement, which is pro-Israel and ferociously hostile to Jeremy Corbyn, and Jewish Voice for Labour, which supported Jeremy Corbyn and is anti-Zionist for the most part, and critical of Israel. Anyway, Jewish Labour Movement is the larger of the two. Now, the panorama failed to acknowledge the existence of Jewish Voice for Labour at all. So the viewer would not have had any idea that there was a fairly significant grouping of Jewish people in the Labour Party who entirely rejected their narrative. It then interviewed a whole range of young, articulate Jewish people who spoke of their horrific experiences in the Labour Party, etc., etc. And anonymized them, giving the impression to the viewer that perhaps they were fearful of repercussions and so on. These people were effectively the board of the Jewish Labour Movement. And the one person amongst that group of people who wasn't on the board of the Jewish Labour Movement was the director of public affairs for the board of deputies.
A quite different approach.
To anonymize, anyone out there who knows anything about journalism knows that's entirely unacceptable. And it's now bleating about transparency with this new film. But I mean, it was, and the BBC's never sort of fessed up to that. It's never apologized. It's just brazened it out.
Well, you did say you didn't want to get into motivations, but nonetheless, I would like to ask you, is this simply the BBC taking an attitude of appeasement and capitulation at the first sign of bullying, which I think we've seen in a number of media organizations? Or do you think it reflects some kind of intrinsic political partisanship among senior BBC management?
Yes, I mean it certainly shows it to be very susceptible to this bullying, which happens in other organisations as well. But you also have significant figures within the BBC. You have Robbie Gibb on the board of governors, who is actually the owner of the Jewish Chronicle, which is a very Zionist newspaper. Rafi Berg, who has been identified, who runs the Middle East section of BBC Online. Who Owen Jones did a very good piece for Dropsite News on this. A huge unhappiness within the organization about his running of the BBC online site. So, I think it's quite a common thing. There's a bunch of things that come together, isn't it? There's an atmosphere. I mean, it reflects also the fact that if you step out of line on this, yes, the Board of Deputies, the Jewish Labour Movement, and other community organizations, which in fact only represent a part of the community, weigh in on you. I mean, the Jewish community in Britain is very small. It's somewhere around 250,000 people. Even proportionally, it's much smaller than the Jewish community in America and I think Canada. And I think the BBC just thinks it's more important to listen to white people, because there's certainly enormous discontent out there amongst Muslims and certainly Palestinians and people of color and others as well. But the BBC regards pressure from some quarters as more important than pressure from others.
Or could we say that perhaps some quarters are more experienced and much better at mobilizing pressure than others who simply make their opposition known generally without doing it in an organized and properly directed manner?
Yes. I mean, obviously one avoids conspiracy theories, blah, blah, blah. The lobby in Britain and in America has been doing it for years. It's very well funded and it does a very good job. Yeah, and I think one could turn around and say, well, where are the many very wealthy Arab Americans? Why don't they do a better job? I think it is harder for them. I think Muslims in Britain certainly are very hesitant to speak up, put their heads above the parapet. They're far more likely to be, if they do, to be subject to quite sort of racist campaigns to silence them and to marginalize them and so on. So yes, on one level, I would say, well, get yourself organized, do as good a job of advocating for Palestine as the other side does. But, there's a racist dynamic at work, which does make it much harder for them.
Yeah, well, without taking anything away from that, I guess the point I'm trying to raise is, when these pro-Israeli forces have an objection to something that's done by the BBC, they address the BBC and its senior management directly. But when pro-Palestinian forces have a problem with something done by the BBC, they tend to talk to each other.
Well, I think they do send letters to the BBC. They just get ignored.
Yeah,
We never
yeah,
hear that they've sent letters because no one publicizes the fact people do contact the BBC. It just doesn't have any effect.
yeah. Okay. So you do feel that there are organized efforts by people who feel that the BBC has really gone off the deep end during the past 2 years, but that the BBC has decided these people and their perspectives are basically unimportant.
Yes, I think that that's essentially right. I mean, the British political media
Mhm,
class is a sort of cozy,
mhm,
fuzzy, centrist thing. They all marry each other. They all go to each other's dinner parties. They all, and they have a rather closed worldview. And I think actually it's very dangerous because I don't think they realize how out of touch they are. I
mhm,
mean, in Britain, in America, obviously we have the Trump phenomenon. In Britain, we have the rise of reform. Similar, there's similarly a far right tidal wave coming to sweep these people away. And I think they are vulnerable because they are
mhm.
a very closed club, very metropolitan, and it's not healthy.
And do you feel that has it always been this way? I think for many people, the BBC's coverage since October of 2023 has been somewhat of a revelation. If we compare if we compare it to BBC reporting in decades past, there does seem to have been a significant difference ironically enough, it took genocide for the BBC to reveal its true colors, if you will. Would you agree that this is not the BBC that we've known from previous decades?
Yeah, I don't know how good it's been in the past either, but
Well, I'm not saying good, but I can't remember it being, for example, every time a Palestinian guest comes on, he's basically Israeli talking points are repeated
yes,
to him.
Palestinians are interrogated. They're
Yes.
not interviewed. They're interrogated.
Mm,
Yes, I mean, it's certainly been particularly bad. I think, in a way, going back to the Jeremy Corbyn thing, going back to the first film
mm,
that I made for Al Jazeera, that did help to establish the framework. I mean, the basic point with Jeremy Corbyn is when you really, really looked at the allegations of anti-Semitism, well over 90% of the time, what people were talking about was anti-Zionism,
mm,
sometimes rather inarticulately and crudely expressed, but it was anti-Zionism. And it established a framework, it established a mindset whereby criticism of Israel and the championing of Palestinians was delegitimized, was demonized, and in doing so, that facilitated the dehumanization of the Palestinian people. And I think that, it has deep roots, but I think that that Corbyn period did play a part in setting the sort of tone for how the BBC and others have covered this war. Because I think many people are just bemused. It's not as if the media here is indifferent to the appalling suffering of Palestinians, but the range of the media ranges here, the mainstream media, ranges, frankly, from outright complicity through to sort of impotent hand-wringing. There is pretty much no one saying, hang on, this is the greatest crime of the 21st century and we should be doing whatever we can to stop it.
mm.
There's a sort of a tolerance of it that I think people find bewildering, and it just wouldn't be applied to anyone else other than the Palestinians.
And it's interesting, as you said, Israelis are interviewed, Palestinians are interrogated. And what does this tell us more broadly about how the BBC and other major Western media corporations have approached reporting on Israel and the Palestinians, particularly since October 23?
Yes, I mean, when people come at the Middle East, their fundamental assumption is that the problem is the Palestinians.
Mhm,
If you come at it from an academic perspective or from the perspective of anyone who doesn't live in the white West, Israel is an apartheid state. It's the state whose defining feature is that it is structured to ensure the domination of one ethnicity over another. All of the world's leading human rights organizations have concluded this, including B'Tselem, which is Israeli. And that core fundamental truth is the one thing you are not allowed to acknowledge in Western media. If you actually look at the whole debate around anti-Semitism, it all drives relentlessly towards, it's actually Article 7 of the IHRA definition, where you are not allowed to refer to Israel as a racist endeavor. In other words, Palestinians must not be allowed to articulate what is the core reality of their experience for the last century. And that's what this is all about. I mean, I think smarter Zionists and Zionist lobbyists recognize that, simply expecting Western media to do Israeli propaganda is a big ask, although certain outlets seem to be prepared to do it. But on the whole, as long as you can make it contested, it's an issue, it's a debate, and it's not about apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. As long as you keep it on that terrain, you're safe. And the greatest weapon to do that is to keep the victims on the back foot by accusing. So we're in a situation where basically the racists accuse the victims of racism, and it just turns the whole thing on its head and leaves people sort of dizzy and disoriented.
And on this line, we've just spoken about your Corbyn documentary, but you've recently also looked into another very prominent case, and that is what is known as the Amsterdam pogrom. Are there any particular aspects of this that caught your attention in terms of fitting into this general pattern that
it absolutely fits into it? So the events, again, for your viewers who aren't familiar with this, it was a football match between Maccabi Tel Aviv, Israeli team, and Ajax Amsterdam, which Ajax won 5-0. It was in Amsterdam, and there was violence after the event, after the match. And this was headlines around the world. It was universally portrayed as a pogrom. Now, if you looked into it, actually what happened, I mean, in general, very often football supporters turning up in a foreign city can be a very aggressive thing. They like the sense that they're taking over the streets, and so on. And this was the case with the Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters, and involved an awful lot of chanting of racist, anti-Palestinian songs and slogans, and smashing up taxis. Many taxi drivers in Amsterdam are Moroccan. They were smashing up taxis, beating up Muslims and so on. Some people fought back, and there were messages from WhatsApp groups. There was a message found on a WhatsApp group which referred to a Jew hunt. Okay. But this was portrayed as a pogrom. And what was remarkable, and you see the Israeli propaganda machine swinging into action on this very, very quickly, within hours of it happening, sort of before everyone else in the world is up. And Western media and Western politicians just felt obliged to fall in line. And of course, over the coming days and weeks, it became clear that it wasn't a pogrom. This was being mischaracterized. But by then, of course, the damage is done. Now, my focus in particular was a piece of footage. If you watched the reporting on the morning of this was all last November, on the morning afterwards, almost all the reports used a very disturbing piece of footage where you see mobs of hooded figures running through the streets and beating up individuals. Okay, this was used almost universally to illustrate this narrative of anti-Semitic mobs rampaging through the streets of Amsterdam. It showed the exact opposite. I mean, the mob were the Maccabi supporters, and the victims were individual Dutch citizens. And the woman who shot this, a Dutch sort of citizen journalist who shot it, had made it very clear to the people she'd provided the footage to. She was on social media making it very, very clear. And over the next few days, she really dug her heels in and was insisting on people properly reporting it. And it was like pulling teeth. I mean, the entire world's media had leapt on this story when they thought it was one narrative. When it turned out, certainly in those pictures, it was the opposite narrative. They did not want to know. And by the time they very, very grudgingly started to put out half corrections, of course, the world's media's attention had moved on.
I think she's still waiting for an apology.
Oh, yeah. I mean, certainly from Sky. I mean, Sky News did a disgraceful thing where somehow they accurately reported it initially. Some poor journalist thought it was her job to do her job. And
made the mistake of telling the truth.
Yes. They very quickly pulled it down with this very offensive message saying it didn't fit our ideas of impartiality. I mean, it's actually a perfect case study because you can see what their idea of impartiality in this instance is to lie. Extraordinary. Sky has never made any comment on this. It was pointed out, it was flagged up, but they've never apologized to her. They've never even communicated with her.
You've identified the Corbyn years as kind of a turning point, if I can use that term. Um, these kinds of incidents that we're discussing today, were they just as prevalent and routine, let's say, in the early part of this century,
I
or
don't
the
think so. I think the weaponization of anti-Semitism to disarm opponents of Israel and champions of the Palestinians is a relatively modern thing. I think it particularly gathered momentum after the 2014 Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip. And I think each time the Israelis sort of clubbed the Gaza Strip into submission, the Israelis were aware that it didn't look good. And I think there was a particular effort to find ways of fighting back, particularly after 2014.
and that was because of the particular brutality of that Israeli onslaught on the Gaza Strip.
Yes, and there had been one in 2009, of course, as
Yeah,
well. But
yeah,
in 2014, I think was a turning point for quite a lot of people, and it
yeah.
was a sort of precursor to what's happened now recently.
As a final question, I'd like to ask you, you've briefly addressed this, which is that Palestinian journalists in the Gaza Strip have been the main sources of reporting on the genocide since October of 2023. How would you assess the conduct of their peers in the Western media towards the unprecedented Israeli campaign against Palestinian journalists? You've mentioned that a press vest, rather than providing protection, is kind of holding a red flag to the Israeli Air Force or the
On the
Israeli
behavior
military, rather.
of Western media, had these been Ukrainian journalists being threatened by the Russian state, and had the Russian state had a track record of murdering journalists in the way the Israeli state does, then there would have been universal solidarity. People would have taken steps to see what they could do, see
There
what they
would have
could
been candlelight vigils and all the rest of it. Yeah.
do, and all the rest of it. I mean, it's been frankly disgusting. Um, Fairly recently, the Israelis put out a statement saying they'd identified 6 of my Al Jazeera colleagues as being Hamas. Now, given what's happened in the past, this can clearly be understood as being quite likely to be a testing of the water. Are we going to be able to get away with killing these people? Mercifully, they haven't so far killed these people. But I mean, the Western media reported this as this is what the Israelis say. Al Jazeera says it's not true. I mean, it was disgusting, frankly. It's quite frankly disgusting. And the business at the Royal Television Society last Wednesday, I'm the empty. I seem to be on a prolonged campaign to make myself unemployable in British television. But Jesus Christ, the empty sanctimony of that room full of people who stood up and for a minute's silence and applauded the Palestinian, the content of films about Gaza. And then when the Royal Television Society, does this frankly disgustingly racist thing of withdrawing the award for Palestinian journalists, and now apparently says it's going to look into why Hind Cowdery was even nominated. Not a squeak, or scarcely a squeak. Not a squeak from these people. I mean, the lack of moral backbone. It's just extraordinary.
And what would it take for things to change? Do you have any hope that things can
Yes,
change?
it's generational. I think the encouragement I take is, as I say, the political media class, certainly in Britain, is woefully out of touch with the general public. The Labour Party will be wiped out at the next election. I'm telling you that now. They can't see it coming, but they will be. Unfortunately, they'll be largely wiped out from the right. But the thing to do is you just keep doing decent journalism and putting it out there. In this age of social media, they can't repress you in the way they used to want to. There is a lot of very good independent media out there now. The vacuum is so enormous that it is being filled by very good independent media. People need to be encouraged to look towards that independent media, not to trust, not to rely on the BBC. And others like that. I think, I sometimes think there'll be a tipping point, a generational tipping point. I think the powers that be are desperately pushing back against it. But I think it's one of those things where in 20, 30 years' time, people will look back in absolute horror at the way the political media establishment of the West behaved during this period. They'll be absolutely horrified.
And this ironic situation that as the Western media establishment is conducting itself in ways that, as you point out, will be will be seen as absolutely shameful in the future. Nevertheless, the broader public is perhaps better informed than ever, precisely because of this diffusion of media, whether by alternative networks such as Al Jazeera that you work with, or by social media or independent journalists, as
Well,
is the
and
case in
also,
Amsterdam. Yeah.
this is why they banned TikTok.
Mm.
Also just large numbers of people, and to a degree on the mainstream news, but if not on mainstream news, on social media, have seen pictures of murdered children
Mm.
for the last 18 months, daily pictures of murdered children. And in a way, there's no great mystery about this. They reacted as normal human beings would, which is to say, well, hang on, there's something profoundly wrong
Doesn't
here.
seem right. Yeah.
This doesn't seem right.
Mm.
And I saw a bizarre thing on the telly the other morning. This pollster from one of the main organizations, she was sitting there with a furrowed brow. She was saying it's mystifying, the attitudes towards Palestine, where the polls very clearly show a very substantial majority of people supporting the Palestinians over people supporting the Israelis. And she was clearly completely mystified by this, and it absolutely epitomized the sort of degree to which they're out of touch. But I think, I think the great hope here is the general public, because the general public has twigged that this isn't as they're being told it is, and that there is a gross moral crime being committed here, and it's unacceptable. And I think the political class will pay a price for that.
Richard Sanders, thank you very much for sharing your insights and expertise with Connections. It's been a very insightful and fascinating conversation. Thank you very much.